I would like to welcome you all to this year's Samuel D. Affron lecture that was made possible through the generosity of Jerome Affron in memory of his father, Samuel Affron. I would also like to introduce some members of the Affron family. Steve, would you please stand? And Steve's son. Thank you for representing your family this evening. We also have a number of very, very close friends of the college that we would just like to acknowledge. Mayor Judy Kennedy, the mayor of the city of Newburgh. The chairman of our board of trustees and his wife Nancy, Abel Garrigan and Nancy Garrigan. Also from our board, Sister Lucy Pavlonis. And former trustees, Sister Joanne Beneski, Elizabeth Mannion, and Joseph McGowan. And also, we can't forget Dr. John D'Ambrosio, the president of the Orange County Chamber, and Marilyn D'Ambrosio. And Mrs. Patricia Larkin. Over the years, we have been fortunate to have some very, very prominent speakers speak on subjects of great importance and of great interest. Over the years. We've had Dr. Richard Heinzel, the founder of Doctors Without Borders Canada. We've had Edwin Newman of NBC News, Dr. Henry Kissinger, and Senator William Proxmire. This evening, we take ourselves over to the world of literature and the arts, and to introduce this evening's speaker is the president of Mount St. Mary College, Father Kevin Mackey.
Thanks, Joe. Good evening and welcome one and all to this celebration of storytelling. Storytelling is a gift often unwrapped in the enjoyment of great books as a youngster and through the influence of one's parents. And so it was for our very special guest this evening, Barbara Taylor Bradford, whose books are published in over 90 countries in 40 languages, with sales figures in excess of $85 million. Back to the beginning. Barbara Taylor had a mother who was a voracious reader and who introduced her to books at the tender age of 4. By the time the Leeds youngster was 12, she had read all the books of Dickens and the Bronte sisters. As Barbara puts it, seeds for the future were sown. After school, when she was 15 and a half, Barbara started work as a typist for the Yorkshire Evening Post. At age 16, she was promoted to cub reporter. At 18, she became the newspaper's woman's page editor. At 20, she headed for London and became fashion editor of the magazine Woman's Own. In her ensuing years in Fleet Street, she covered every beat from crime to show business for the London Evening News, Today magazine, and other publications. Now, in many great stories, love steps in, and so it is with our story. Just as she felt destined to become, and I quote, a hard-bitten reporter in a dirty trench coat, end quote, Barbara Taylor went on a blind date and met her husband-to-be, American film producer Robert Bradford, and fell in love at first sight. In 1963, they married, and Barbara Taylor Bradford moved to the USA. Robert, please stand to be recognized by the audience. For 12 years, Barbara wrote a syndicated column, Designing Woman, which appeared in 183 newspapers across America and garnered several awards. She also wrote books on decorating and children's books. However, Barbara never lost her desire to write fiction. Barbara Taylor Bradford's turning point came in 1976 when she sold A Woman of Substance to a publisher. The rest, as I say, is history. She has to date written 27 novels, each dedicated to Bob. Robert Bradford produces all of her television films and spearheads her professional activities. Within Barbara Taylor Bradford's 27 novels, readers are transported to locales in like 20th century England, New York, Texas, the south of France, the Caribbean, Chicago, and Venice. Noting that many of her beloved page-turners have been made into films, we can also be impressed by the acting talents who have graced television versions of Barbara's works. They include Sir Anthony Hopkins, Sir John Mills, Jenny Seagrove, Gail Hunnicutt, Liam Neeson, Deborah Kerr, James Brolin, Miranda Richardson, Claire Bloom, Ian Richardson, Gene Simmons, Melissa Gilbert, and many more. Barbara Taylor Bradford's latest book, Letter from a Stranger, has roots in World War II. The lead character, Justine Nolan, is a documentary filmmaker with a distant mother and a grandmother she's been told is dead. But I won't spoil the story. You'll have to read it yourself. Barbara Taylor Bradford has received many well-deserved awards, including an honorary Doctor of Letters degree from Leeds University, and several others, including Mount St. Mary College, class of 2011. Other awards include the City of Hope Spirit of Life Award and the establishment of the Barbara Taylor Bradford Research Fellowship in Pediatric Leukemia, the Albert Einstein College of Medicine's Spirit of Achievement Award, Writers Hall of Fame of America, and of course the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. In addition to her hectic writing schedule, Barbara Taylor Bradford manages to serve on the Police Athletic League for Underprivileged Children, the Authors Guild of America Council, Parents and Abducted Children Together, as well as literary partners. She's also involved in Meals on Wheels and the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation. I look forward to hearing more about the writing life of our honored guest tonight. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming A Woman of Substance, Barbara Taylor Bradford, Mount St. Mary College, class of 2011.
One moment.
I'll get it for you.
Just wanted to open the water. Well, thank you all for coming, and it's lovely to be back here, and I recognized quite a lot of faces, as you know, and said, yes, I know you, but then you had your badge, so I could really greet you properly. Thank you. I think I'm going to put it on the floor, though, because it might slide. I think it's... oh, thank you very much. Sorry about all that. But I once saw Paul Newman at the Oscars, and he got a very dry mouth, and he was gagging, and I thought, that's never going to happen to me when I'm on a podium. Anyway, thank you for those kind words, Father Kevin. Bob and I, that is, met Father Kevin at Siena College some years ago when I got an honorary doctorate, and we all fell in love, didn't we, the three of us? And here I am again to see you, and thank you for inviting me tonight. And I want to thank Mr. Affron and his son for actually underwriting the lecture. Thank you very much. So, Father Kevin told you lots of things about my beginnings, if you like. People usually ask me two questions when I meet them. what made you want to write? How did you actually start writing? And the other question is, where do you get your ideas? So I think Father Kevin addressed quite a few things about how I started writing, so I don't have to go through all that stuff. But I will say this, when I was 15 and a half, I came home one day to my mother, I was still at school, and I said, I've got a job, I have something to tell you, I've got a job on the Yorkshire Evening Post. And she said, you mean for the summer? And I said, no, a job, a job, I'm going to leave school and go to work. And she was furious, and so was my father, and they were very much against it. And my mother said to me, well, you've been for an interview, why didn't you tell me? I should have come with you. I said, then I wouldn't have been given the job if you came with me. She thought I was going to be a reporter, but of course they weren't going to give a job to a 15-and-a-half-year-old girl. So I said, no, I'm not going to be a reporter. I am going to be working as a typist. That infuriated my parents even more. And my mother said, but I wanted you to go to Leeds University. And I said, but you don't learn journalism in a university, because in England we don't have many journalism schools, and certainly not all those years ago. So we made a deal. My mother said, 1 week. And I said, no, give me 2 weeks. And if I don't like it, I will leave, and I'll go back to school, and I'll go to Leeds University. Well, I've got to tell you, I hated that job. I wanted to leave the second day, never mind after 2 weeks. But I'm very determined, and my problems were this. I was so panic-stricken the first few days that I could not read my shorthand, and I've got news for you, neither could any of the other girls in the typing pool. And they said, what? Is this Pitman's? Is this whatever else? And I said, no, I think it's Barbara Taylor's shorthand. So the other thing was, I made typing mistakes. And we didn't have whiteout in those days. So I had an indelible eraser. So a lot of my letters had small holes. And you could do that and just see people through the letter. Anyway, the problem was, obviously, I had to present these very standard letters to the advertising manager and the various people that I was doing letters for, and I couldn't, so the girls helped me. And the first day, we all stayed till 7 o'clock at night doing all my letters. Then they went home, and I stayed because I realized we had a great deal of waste paper. And it was the Yorkshire Conservative newspaper company. They were very rich. And the paper was not just paper, it was heavy paper, and it was embossed. And I looked at the waste paper basket and I thought, they'll fire me when they find out I've wasted all this paper. So I tried to burn it in the ladies' room, and I almost burnt down the building. I then thought, this won't do. I went back, smoothed the paper out, folded it up, and buried it in my desk drawers. I got home quite late, and my mother said, this job, you've got to give it up tomorrow. Why are you coming home at 9 o'clock at night? And I explained, I said, no, I've got to go back. I hate the job, Mummy, but I'm going back because every day I've got to bring this paper home and burn it. So she said, but if you don't like the job, I said, because they'll fire me. She said, but if you don't like the job, why does that matter? I said, well, I don't ever want anybody to say I was fired from a job. I mean, really. So that's what I did. I took that paper home for a week. By this time, I'd got the hang of it, so I stayed. But there's something in life called raw ambition, and this kid from Leeds, now 16, decided this is very dull in this typing pool. At one moment, they'd sort of I guess, promoted me slightly, and I was put into another room where you typed, and this time I was taking copy from reporters out on the beat. So you had earphones and a typewriter, and they dictated, and I saw how to set out a story. So I was now 16, I'd risen up a bit, and I thought, I'm going to write for this paper. So what do? I start to cover little events that happen in the local area where I live, came and wrote some stories, and knew how to do it. I knew where it should be put, on whose desk it should be put. And over a period of a few months, like 2 months, 8 weeks, I did 4 stories, and they all appeared in the paper, usually saying by a Yorkshire Evening Post correspondent. And I looked at it, oh, that's me, that's my story. What happened one day is the woman who ran the typist pool called me into her office and said, "What have you done?" And I said, "Nothing." And she said, "Well, the editor wants to see you." "Oh," I said, "maybe it's about my stories." "Well, what stories?" says she. And I said, "Well, just some stories, and why am I in trouble?" She said, "Well, I don't know, but they want to see you over there at editorial. And remember one thing, every girl that comes here wants to be a journalist, and they never are," said she. So I thought, well, I'll show you. So I go and I'm taken into the editor. Here is this glamorous man from Fleet Street, Barry Horniblower, Savile Row suit and silver hair, and he looks at me and says, "Are you Barbara Taylor?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How old are you?" I said, "I'm 16. He said, "Well, did you do these stories?" I said, "Yes." "And how did you find out, sir?" At least I could say, I didn't know to say sir, because you don't really ask the editor, do you? How do you find out? He said, "They want to pay you for these stories." And that's how we found you. We didn't know who Barbara Taylor was, and then one very clever young bookkeeper saw you on the books as a typist. "So we have to pay you for these." And so we sat and we talked a few minutes, and he said, "So do you want to be a journalist?" And I said, "Oh, I do, sir, but I don't want to be. I'm going to be." And he said, "Fine, and I'm going to help you." So 2 months later, I was promoted again. I was assistant to his secretary. And from there, I moved eventually into the reporter's room. I became a cub reporter. The woman's page editor got sick, so I took over the pages, and she wanted me to cover for her, so no one knew for a while, and the editor found out and said, "Why have we got an 18-year-old doing the women's pages of a daily paper?" So that is how I moved along on the Yorkshire Evening Post, and I went to work in London when I was 20. But I never really lost that desire to write fiction, and one day I did, 20 years later. I married Bob and came to live in America, and I was a journalist here. But I had all this stuff going around in my head and stories that I wanted to tell, and people would jump into my mind that were fictional people, of course. Which brings me now to where do I get my ideas from? But before I go to that, I must tell you that Ernest Hemingway said to someone once, "You can't call yourself a writer unless you've been paid for what you've written." Well, long before I was paid for those stories in the Yorkshire Evening Post, I was paid 10 shillings and sixpence by a magazine in England, a children's national magazine, when I was 10, because I'd started to write when I was 7, and my mother finally liked something I wrote, so at 10 years old, I was 10, she sent the story to the magazine, and they ran it, and they paid me. So I meet Hemingway's standard. I was paid at 10, so I was a writer from the age of 10, and proud of it. So, ideas. That's what everybody wants to know. Well, they also want to know, what is your method of working, but let me talk about the ideas first. I really don't know, honestly, where they come from. I'll give you one example. Bob and I were in Berlin a few years ago, and he was born there, and the wall had come down, so we went to Berlin. He was making one of my books into a movie in London, and they were editing, so he took a week off, and we went to Berlin. And we were walking down the street, and I suddenly stopped, and I said to him, "Did you have anybody in your family called Ursula?" And he said, "No. Why?" I said, "You know, a woman popped into my head, and I thought maybe you talked about her, but her name's Ursula." He said, "No, not in my family. There was no one called Ursula. But in my mind's eye, as we'd walked down the Unter den Linden, I had seen in my head a blonde, blue-eyed, diamond earrings, a dress somewhat of the 1930s, in a room like a ballroom with chandeliers." And it stayed with me. Bob didn't know who it was. It wasn't anyone he'd ever talked about, and that was in the late 1980s. About a year and a half later, I came up with an idea for a book called The Women in His Life, and that was about the women behind a man who became a tycoon. It wasn't about the women that he'd had romantic liaisons with, but about his mother, his grandmother, his wife, his daughter. And as I was writing the outline, I suddenly thought, oh, an Ursula that I met on the streets of Berlin a year ago is his mother. So I'd no idea about the women in his life when I thought of Ursula, but there she was. Suddenly that character had come into my head. I sort of had a vision of Emma Hart for a woman of substance in the same way. I was analysing what my first novel would be. I had started but not finished 4 novels, and then I thought, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And I asked myself a lot of questions one day, and I came up with the answers on a yellow pad. I said, what do you want to write about? I want to write, what kind of book? I want to write a traditional family saga, and so on. I asked myself questions, and I wrote down the answers, and my final line was, I want to write a book about a woman who starts with nothing and becomes a woman of substance. And as I said that, I had an instant vision of Emma Hart as a little girl. So sometimes it is a character that gives you the idea for the novel, because it was the English writer Graham Greene who taught me something. I never met him, and he's dead now, but I read an interview in the 70s that he had given to the Sunday Times of London, and it was a very good question that the journalist asked. He said, when you sit down every day, Mr. Greene, and you start your novel, what do you keep at the front of your mind? And he said, I always remind myself that character is plot. What my protagonist is within himself or herself as a human being, his character or her character will tell that person's life story. So character is destiny. And when I read that, I knew how to write a novel to start with a character, but sometimes it doesn't always work that way. The new book, Letter from a Stranger, I didn't know anything about the story I was going to tell, but I became fascinated in 2009 with the number of stories that I read about women who suddenly went missing. You know, you'd read a story about a woman who went out in Idaho, somewhere in Idaho, to buy a pound of potatoes or something and never came home. Where was she? That nobody knew. Then they found a dead body or a body that's been raped and killed. Not only in America, But I saw those stories in English papers, and I'm particularly interested in missing people because I'm on the board of a charity in England called PACT, which is Parents and Abducted Children Together, started by a friend of mine whose children were abducted by her first husband, who was their father. She didn't see them for 10 years. So missing people, missing children, I've always thought, what would I feel? I used to try and stand in Catherine Mayer, this is the woman who founded that charity, I used to think, how would I deal with that? Or what if my mother disappeared? Or my sister? I don't have a sister, but if I did, someone you love vanishes in the blink of an eyelash. They've gone. What is left in that family? So I was pondering this and wondering how to use that plot line, I suppose we would say, for a book, and I couldn't really think of one because it seemed dismal that somebody disappears, and it's horrendous if you think about it, and they don't come back and they're dead, or they've run away with another man or whatever. So I let it go, but not long after that, I suddenly thought the worst cases, in a way, they're all bad, but the worst cases happened in World War II. Now, I must tell the men here who have not read my books, other than Robert Bradford, that they're not romances. They're about a lot of things. They're about life and tragedy and sorrow and happiness and death and murder and making great family fortunes. And they're also about history. There's a lot of history interwoven into my books. And I suddenly thought, the Holocaust, that was the worst possible thing, when people just one day, you go home and your mother's not there or your husband's gone. And eventually, after a lot of thought and pondering, I came up with a plot line that would feature not only the present time, in the year 2004, but also the past, the Second World War and Berlin and the fall of Berlin. Of course, when you're writing history, you didn't live at that time, and I didn't live in Nazi Germany, you have to do your research. And for this book, I used, for the fall of Berlin, which was horrific, I used a book by the man who was the mentor of my writing career as a book writer rather than a journalist. He was a foreign correspondent in London when I was on newspapers in London, and his name was Cornelius Ryan. Connie wrote, and all the men here will remember this, The Last Battle, which was Berlin, The Longest Day, which of course was made into a movie, and A Bridge Too Far, which was about the bridge at Remagen. So that was my basis of the research for my Berlin section of this book. And because I'd sort of thought of this book not from page 1 to page 450, but I thought of, well, how will I cover Berlin if I'm going to use this and there are missing people? So I immediately went to Connie's book, which he had given me years ago, which is The Last Battle, the way that Berlin fell. And the interesting thing to me was that it had no defenses whatsoever. That had been something in Hitler's head, because he never thought Berlin would be attacked, because he never thought the Allies would win the war. He thought the Third Reich would live for 1,000 years, but it didn't. So I did a lot of research about Berlin, and as I was doing that, I suddenly found my missing person, and I found my plot. And then I sat down and thought, all right, how is this book going to begin? So you see, it didn't start with a character. The characters, in a way, came last. And that's why I can never really tell you where my ideas come from. The other question that I'm always asked is, how do you work? What do you do? Well, guess what? I use a typewriter. I'm still on a typewriter, an IBM Selectric #2 wheelwriter. And Bob is always having to find typewriters that are for sale because I cannot write on a computer. I can research, but the screen does something to me. What happens to me is that I totally lose all my creativity because the screen says, put something on me very quickly. In other words, it doesn't allow me to think. So I use a typewriter. And as Bob says, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I write on a typewriter, I write in longhand. I often start a chapter and I know a lady, wherever you are, put your hand up. Somebody asks me, how do you write your books? Where is she? She didn't come to the talk. No, I'm kidding you. Anyway, how do I do it? Well, I get up a lot at 4:30 in the morning. And I have my coffee, and I look at the British papers that come about 5:30. But before that, I've had the coffee, and I've got dressed, and everybody's asleep, and I look at the papers. But I actually always like to have something to edit at that hour. So what I'm doing is edit what I've written the day before. At 7:30, Bob usually gets up, so then I stop and make his breakfast. 2 boiled eggs, 4 minutes, so I've got to stand there and time 4 minutes. And I give him a kiss, and I give him his eggs, and I leave him and go back to my office, and I stay there till about 5 o'clock. I stop for lunch. I'm writing on a yellow pad. I'm typing that up. I might be doing research, checking dates and things to be, not that I may want them for the book, but because you've got to write from great strength and know every little bit of research without really always putting that in, because it gets boring for the reader. Most of the time, though, in that room, I think, because that is what writing is. It's clear expression of thought. And I have to do a lot of thinking. I call myself a juggler. Every day I've got balls going up in the air like this because I have a story to tell, so we have to look at the plot. I have to have the characters in the book express what they are as human beings. Dialogue has to move a plot along. If you recorded a conversation I might have with one of you, it would be a lot of ums and ers and wells and silences. Dialogue has to be actually really constructed to tell the reader what the person is, what they're thinking, but it's got to move the plot. So all the time that I'm working every day, I have all of those things to think of, but then I have to say, all right, this reader must know that this is Berlin in 1943, and the Americans have come into the war, and Berlin is being heavily bombed. Or, if it's not this current book, this is England in 1902. It's the beginning of the Edwardian period. So you're doing many things every day, and it's very hard. I don't think writing fiction can be taught. I think writing can be taught, and grammar. And you can teach somebody how to take facts and turn it into a biography, or facts and turn it into a history. But to write fiction, you're playing God, you're creating people that don't exist, you're creating lives that never happened, and to be a novelist, you've got to be a really good liar You've got to be able to tell all these lies about people that never existed in places that are real, so you've got to make the people real. When people say, you know, I want to write a book and I want to be famous like you, I say, then you won't be. And they say, what do you mean? Do you mean I don't have any talent? And I say, no, you probably have a lot of talent, but it shouldn't be the goal to be famous. Your goal must be to write the book because you can't not write it. You've got to do it because you have to, because it's something inside you that has to come out, and you've got to say all these things. And in the process of being an entertainer, because that's what I am, I write commercial fiction, if you want to call it that, or popular fiction. That aside, I believe that I do send a message without meaning to. I create something that people enjoy, which is the entertainment part, but I hope that I also touch people and move them, and sometimes maybe even make them think. And because they're seeing life as I see it, they're seeing it through my eyes. And many people obviously do think the way I do and enjoy the books, because I do have a lot of fans. So writing fiction is not the same as any kind of other writing, because you must also not only be a good liar, but you must have a very vivid imagination. Just to digress for a minute, I'm almost out of time. A woman came to me she didn't actually come to me, she lurked down there at an event a few years ago. And I began to get very nervous, because I thought, oh, is this a stalker, maybe? And I remember a man who had been my publisher once saying to me, you know, Barbara, you really have to stand at a podium. You mustn't sit at a desk. And I said, when you're doing an event, I said, why not? He said, but what if you have to run? I said, why would I have to run? I'm not one of your political writers. You know, I'm not this or that, him or her. I write fiction. He said, but you never know in life. And I thought, maybe George was right. I mean, who's that woman? As it turned out, the organizer of the event knew I was getting nervous, and she came to me and said, what's wrong? And I said, that lady over there, you know, who is she? I think she's a stalker. She said, leave it to me. And she comes back a few minutes later and she said, she's not. But she's got every book you've ever written, including some decorating books. And she doesn't want to slow the line down for your signing, so she wants to be last. But she wants to see you, you know, look at you. So anyway, eventually it's her turn, and she told me her name was Tanya. And I signed all her books, and I signed the one that had just come out, and then she gives me a book that is an old, raggedy, well-used paperback. And as I look at it, there's a hole right through the middle that you could push a pencil through. And as if she didn't know it, I said, there's a hole in this book. She said, yes, my husband shot it. So I looked at her, and, you know, I'm very quick, and I said, well, I'm glad the bullet missed you, because I had visions of her sitting there, you know, and where did the bullet go? So she said, oh, would you please write that in the book? I said, no, obviously this book has caused trouble in your family. She said, you can write it because it doesn't matter. I said, what do you mean? She said, I've divorced him. I said, oh, not because of me. So, you know, now you know what some people think about my books, right? They shoot them. Then there was the little boy who I would say was about 14, waiting for me outside the BBC once when I'd been doing a talk show, and he had an autograph book. And he said, could I have your autograph, Mrs. Bradford? I love your books. And I think that he's getting this for his mum. And I said, you're getting this for your mum? He said, no, I love your books. And I said, do you read them? He said, no, I watch them on television. Which brings me to Robert Bradford, my husband, who was a movie producer and became a television producer, to make all these books. He's made 10. You've got to catch up. I've done 27. Anyway, Bob did have marvelous casts in A Woman of Substance and all of the others. And I just wanted to say that a lot of people have asked me, what happened to A Woman of Substance? Was it ever on DVD? Well, in fact, it was. And it's coming out again now in America and England. Acorn is a company that just recently bought it, and I think it's 6 hours of A Woman of Substance and 4 hours of Hold the Dream and 4 hours of To Be the Best. So that's 14 hours of The Woman of Substance, the first books in that series, with some marvelous actors, as Father Kevin already told you. My favourite was always Liam Neeson as Blackie, and Deborah Carr as Emma, and Jenny Seagrove, and Tony Hopkins was great in To Be the Best. Lindsay Wagner, Bob always had wonderful stars, and some of the scripts sometimes were not quite the book, but for the most part, it's good to have your husband as the producer because he really wants to do his best for you. So, any questions? Because my time is up. I've not really given a lecture, but yeah. It's Patricia, right?
How long does it take you to complete a book? I have a teacher voice, I don't think that.
How long does it take me to complete a book? Well, it does depend on the book. I mean, A Woman of Substance took me 2 years because I'd never finished a novel, you know, and I was, in a way, teaching myself. And my editor would say, do you want to come and talk? And I said, yes, I do want to come and talk to you and ask how to do it, but I'm not going to. And she said, no, I'll help you with it. And I said, no, because what if I'm not with you? What if I don't have you as my editor? I can't rely on anybody but myself. So I taught myself to do that book, and it took 2 years because it was long, and it was my first novel. I do a book a year now, but long hours. You know, I am up early, and I do a lot of research for a book whilst I'm writing another one. Oh, I must tell you, I can't, another question there, I'll answer that. Then I must tell you what this book's about that I've just published. So what's your question?
Well, I know you're very busy, but do you ever have a chance to read any of the other authors, young authors, coming into the marketplace? And who would be your favorite author that you might read?
I do read a lot. But when I'm writing a novel, I don't read other people's fiction because I'm afraid of picking up some echo. You know, I once had a great line in a book which my editor laughed about because she said, Barbara, where did you get this line? The strongest steel has to go through the hottest fire. I said, I know what you're going to say. I've just realized it was in David Copperfield. So I don't read other people's fiction. I read a lot of non-fiction. I read a lot of historical histories of kings and queens of England. I just read a marvelous book called An African Love Story about this woman, Daphne Sheldrick, who continued her husband's work preserving elephants in Africa. I'll read a biography, sometimes of an actor. The best biography was by Christopher Plummer, called In Spite of Myself. And I told him, Christopher, that you should write novels. He's an old friend, and it's hilarious. So I read biographies. I stay away from fiction until I go on vacation. And Bob always says, the weight of your shoes and your books, I'm always paying $1,000 in overweight. So now he knows I'm going to have a Kindle, but I'm not giving up the shoes. So the new book, I'll tell you in a sentence and then I'm finished. It's a little boy is given a letter to mail in Istanbul His father's a cook at a villa, and this letter's been written by somebody in that villa, and he takes it and mails it, and he reminds himself to please don't forget you must put it in the international post box because he's going to America. So he mails the letter and goes home, tells his father, I mailed the letter. So the father tells the person at the villa the letter was mailed. He gives him some Turkish delight. He goes and sits on the doorstep and eats his Turkish delight. He's very pleased. He's 10 and he's had this task that he's completed and he's happy. And the omnipotent storyteller, me, says the child had no way of knowing that the letter he had just mailed would change many lives irrevocably. Their lives would never be the same again, because the letter arrives where it was sent to. The address is correct, the letter gets there, the woman doesn't live there anymore. So her daughter opens the letter, and she's opened Pandora's box. She finds out that her mother has lied to them, meaning she and her brother, and that for the last 10 years they've grieved for their grandmother, who supposedly died in a plane crash, but in fact is still alive, the missing woman. And I'm not going to tell you any more. Because I've got to leave. Oh, yes.
I'd like to ask you one question. One of the things that I got out of the introduction, my father was the reading of Charles Dickens material. And what would be your comments about that experience at that younger age, reading all of that material that he created, which was a very dark age of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution like that?
I just didn't quite catch your first sentence.
Where I was saying about Charles Dickens.
Yes, I know all that part.
And just looking back on it, who was one of the great writers of all times, obviously, and he wrote about the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, he
period
did.
And like that, and just what your reflections are today about his writings and like that.
Well, I still think he's the most marvelous writer. And I think it was Joe who asked me, when you became a writer, what novelist did you want to meet? And I sort of looked at him and I said, well, I didn't. I didn't have a hero. And you looked surprised, Joe, at my answer. And eventually I came up with, well, Margaret Thatcher. I did meet Margaret Thatcher a few times. But actually I corrected myself with Joe and said, there wasn't anybody. Well, first of all, I didn't go to events when I first started being published as a novelist, so I didn't have the opportunity. But I did say to you, they're all dead. So yes, today I think Dickens stands up as he did then. He did write about very dark times. I'd read all of Dickens by the time I was about 13 because my mother force-fed Dickens to me. So he is one of my favorite writers, and I think he was almost like a journalist. He's telling it the way it was at that time. And he was a great writer, but as I've discovered lately, not a very nice man, apparently, from all of the stuff that's coming out. But a great writer. Any more questions?
Yes, Mrs. Bradford, it's very fortunate that you have Mr. Bradford as your producer.
Are you kidding? Everybody wants him. All these other women writers.
Yes, often the question is, how do you feel about the way that your books are turned into screenplays and then films and television miniseries? I'm wondering how you address things. How do you give your input as the process is going on to convert these into films?
Well, let's start there. Bob's attitude is, we're making a movie, Barbara. And that's exactly what he's doing. And if only a lot of other writers would understand that the book cannot, all of a book cannot get on the screen. Some books have a lot of thought processes. There's a lot of introspection. You can't film that. A film has got to move constantly. And it's a different medium. So when Bob says to me, I'm making a movie, not a book, yes, he is making a movie. And I think he does his very best because he cares about the books and he's my husband and obviously cares. He knows the work I've put into them and what they mean to me. But he's got to answer to networks and advertisers and all of the stuff that goes on financially to get the movie on the screen. A network has many problems that they have to solve and that he has to work within all of these strictures. But he's always had great stars. The scripts have always been very good. I've always seen the scripts. Sometimes I've asked why this and why that, and that doesn't quite work. And he said, yes, we know. Once I wrote, twice I wrote scripts for him. One was for Hold the Dream, and the other was for the women in his, no, not the women in, Voice of the Heart, Bob, wasn't it? Voice of the Heart and Hold the Dream. And you know something? I much prefer to be a novelist. Because you really, that's what I am, that's what I do, and it's a different technique writing a script. Am I pleased? Yes, of course I'm pleased. I rather would have it on the screen than not at all. And I think if a lot of other writers understood that, a lot of more books would be made. Thank you.
I have one more question.
Yes?
One of our more bashful guests asked me to ask it on her behalf. What does your workspace or study look like?
Oh, well, it's a friend of ours once said, when we just moved in, well, it's now 17 years ago, but when we'd moved into this apartment, he came and looked around, thought it was beautiful, and then he looked at me and said, I'm glad one room looks lived in. And that is my office. It's got yellow walls and a patterned red carpet, and it has a yellow sofa and a yellow chair, and it looks like, with a very nice French desk, and it looks like a sitting room. It's got a wall of books down one side, a window, lamps, and then it's got a long folding table covered with bits of paper and newspaper clippings, and Bob always looks and leaves because he thinks there's something under there that is important that I've lost. And there's a typewriter on a typing table, and there's the, what's it called, computer on the desk. And it's tidy, but my research table is full of junk. But every day or every few days I clean it up because I know he's going to come and say, what's under all this? Is there an invitation where we're supposed to? So it's like a sitting room, actually. And I've always had it like a sitting room. Oh, and a TV there. And all of my books and a lot of research books. So who asked the question? I do have only one now. One we had to send to doggy heaven last year because she was very ill. We have a Bichon Frise, and she always lay under the typing table. She obviously liked the sound of the typewriter. And the other one went in the dog bed. So the same dog is still under the typing table, and she's quite happy now because she's the only child. Gets all the attention. Yes. Hi.
I was wondering how your fans feel about after they read your books and then they watch your movies. I've always been a person who I love movies, and I've always said, oh, I don't need to read a book because I just was always into the movies. And then last year, I got enough, which is awesome when you were talking about your Kindle, and I went back and read Pride and Prejudice. I remember the movie, and now I find myself buying all these books because I love the movies, and the books I love even more. Do you find that your fans, do they enjoy the books so much more than your movies?
I think I'm lucky in that all of the films that Bob has made, and miniseries and movies of the week for television, I think he really has controlled it as best he could, so that a lot of the book does get onto the screen. But it's two different things. You know, when you're reading a book, it's a very private matter between you and the author. It's, you can imagine what the people I've described really look like. It's very intimate. When you're watching a movie, well, you're seeing it all. I always say I myself as a writer compete with television because I do tend to want to describe the room because you can't see it as you can on television. I want to describe the landscape and the clothes because only on television or in the movie theatre can you see all that. My fans, I think they're just happy to know that they can see any Emma Hart movie again and go and see all those stars. I've never had any complaints, actually, except from one person. And this young woman, who was the daughter-in-law of a friend, said, why did you ever let them make Voice of the Heart? That was my favorite book and I hated the movie. And I said, oh, I'm sorry, I wrote the script. So that was the only complaint I've ever had.
Well, thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
So good.
Thank you. I can imagine I've been playing with.
After everything you're saying. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.